Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to today's lecture. Today we are looking at, we have already studied how orality moves to manuscript writing and chirography. But for a moment we will pause and we are going to take a look at a close look at one oral form. The form that I have chosen to bring to you today is a form of oral storytelling which is Dastangoi. Dastangoi is a particular form which did exist for many years within the subcontinent and even outside the subcontinent, but then it sort of discontinued, died out, but it got revived over the last decade or so, and the story that exact story that we are going to be looking at as part of this course is actually another oral storytelling tradition from Rajasthan, which is being narrated in the Dastangoi format. Okay. So, before we go into the story, that is Dastan Chaubali, we are going to look at the history of Dastangoi to begin with. Okay. So, what you see on your screen is a particular a group of people sitting and someone, a lady there standing up and reciting and saying something, and that is image of a storyteller. This is from this is the label says that this is someone reciting a story from the Arabian Nights, or what is Alif Laila. This picture has been taken at around 1911. Of course, you must understand that the very nature of oral storytelling is such that written records are not available in most of the cases. So, we have to rely on more recent experiences, one. Two, we will also have to rely on maybe for images or descriptions of what how storytelling actually occurred through images, paintings and other similar sources. So, this would give you an idea of how storytelling would happen as a form in before the age of television or films. Certainly, it is very interesting to also note that though within the European context we have been dating the rise of print to about the really the 17th and 18th centuries and really consolidated by the 19th. In the rest of the world, print outside that of the West, print takes longer time to consolidate. So, within the subcontinent as well as in the Middle East and other parts of Asia, storytelling, oral storytelling formats continue to have a widespread existence till almost the early 20th century, right. So, returning back to Dastangoi, Dastangoi really is a compound of two Persian words. Dastan, as you understand, is a story, and going is telling. So, Dastangoi is storytelling, and the person who tells the story is called a Dastango. So, these stories are of epic nature. They are recited, or if they were written down, they were read aloud. Okay, we understand that movement from the oral to the manuscript culture continues till about the 19th century in most of these parts of the world. Dastangoi tells us the stories of, or told the stories of adventures of Amir Hamza, who was a warrior, an Arabic warrior, who was supposedly the uncle of Prophet Muhammad. Now, these are all legends. We do not first of all know altogether too much about Amir Hamza, number one. Number two, the stories, once they were created, always moves into, that is the nature of oral narrative, moves into the rapidly into the realm of the fictitious, and as it moves rapidly into the realm of the fictitious, it picks on other stories which get incorporated into the corpus of all the stories that constitute a particular tradition. So, therefore, we cannot say that we can really understand who the figure of Amir Hamza was through the stories themselves. We can certainly have a characterization of Amir Hamza, but we cannot have a clear historical record as to who Amir Hamza was. Now, just to put everything into perspective, Dastangoi is only one of the many storytelling traditions across the world. Just to give you a few examples, just heard of the of Alif Layla, or the story of 1001 Nights, or what is better known as Arabian Nights. All of you know that is part of a kind of a larger narrative within which much smaller narratives are contained, right. It becomes the story of the Arabian Nights becomes a context within which many other stories are included as part of the narrative. It gives a certain structure, and that is by and large how oral narratives actually developed. All right. Smaller stories get incorporated, included into a larger story, the framework of a larger story. There are other sorts of formats. Now, this is very interesting. This is Persian, an image from a Persian manuscript. Now, manuscripts would have illustrations. It was almost like children's books to actually give vent to the imagination of the reader or the listener. The manuscript would include illustrations. Illustrations were a very important facet of manuscript culture. When we look at manuscript culture more closely, we will study it at greater detail. But what you see there is an image of the Panchatantra, image from a story from the Panchatantra. However, this is a manuscript which is Persian, right. Later on in the course, we will look at these distinctions of the various subcontinental languages, but there is one theory that the way we understand the differences in languages within the subcontinent or anywhere in the modern world did not actually exist, was not actually exactly the same form a few centuries ago, number one. Number two, though we identify the story of Panchatantra to be Indian, actually the stories travel. As people travel, so stories travel, and as stories from India or the subcontinent move to the Middle East, stories from the Middle East also come into the subcontinent, and sometimes you will have many stories from various legends almost matching each other. All right. So, you would see certain similarities between various story patterns. Now, this is very clearly a Persian manuscript which tells the story based on the story of the Panchatantra. All right. And the Panchatantra is another very important oral storytelling tradition from the subcontinent, where, as I have already mentioned earlier in the course, it is almost like a tree where there are branches within branches and within branches. Usually many of the narratives, oral narratives, actually have an overarching story, a framework, almost like bracketing smaller stories within it, containing smaller stories within it, as I given example, that was Arabian Nights. But Panchatantra is one which has a branch like structure. Another example of a oral tradition within from the subcontinent which has a contained framework structure is the Betal Pachisi, the story of Vikram and Betal, where the idea is that Vikram has to go and get Betal, and Betal asks him a riddle, and moment he answers, moment he opens his mouth, Betal flies back, and therefore he restarts the story again the next day. So that is another way in which many stories get incorporated within a larger framework. All right. Another very interesting kind of storytelling tradition which is from the subcontinent is that of the Patachitra tradition. This is largely from the eastern parts of the country, primarily Bengal. And one very important aspect of storytelling is something that we are going to see is that it also pays great heed to the visual aspect. So, in the Patachitra you have, it is almost like a comic strip. Each segment is telling one part of the story, and the storyteller actually narrates the story. You can see this is a scroll which has been opened up, and as the storyteller tells the story, keeps on rolling up the top part of the scroll and opening up the bottom part, and holds it before the eyes of the viewer or the group of people seated before them, and tells the story part by part. Okay. And the storyteller really knows the entire story by heart, and most of the times the stories are written, as I said, are composed as verses. As I said, verses are easier to remember, because here in this particular case, for to learn the story, other than the images, the storyteller had to rely completely on memory. Whether in the case of a manuscript like this one, they would have a written script which would work as a mnemonic, which would work as an aid to memory, right. Whereas in the case of the Patachitra, because the narrative is has to be recalled from memory, you see that there is a greater use of versification, because verse is easier to remember. And most importantly to note that the chitrakars, who make these pot paintings, they are the storytellers. So the person who wants to tell a story has to make his own patachitra and his own scroll, which he then uses to tell the story to the audience. All right. And a particular storyteller would have an inventory of a repertoire of stories and scrolls, would be carrying it along with him to tell various stories to the audiences. All right. Sometimes these scrolls would also be passed from generation to generation, from father to son usually, because we are largely talking of a patriarchal world. So, and they would pass on from one generation to another. Sometimes the scrolls will go bad due to wear and tear, and fresh paintings will have to be made. And when fresh paintings are made, maybe new additions can be made into the story, and the story becomes longer or changes a little bit according to the times. They can be adapted. Right. This is another storytelling tradition which you may have come across at some point of time. This is the Kabad tradition from Rajasthan in India, where part by part this kind of a box which opens up, and within that there are illustrations, and the storyteller tells the story. Once again, the storyteller has to rely largely on memory, other than the images which will give him a kind of a cue to the sequence of stories, but the stories are organized as parts of this large door, sort of door which is a multi-hinged door, which sort of keeps on opening, and one by one the narrative slowly unfolds. It is almost like the narrative unfolding. Now, what you see in the case of a scroll, very interestingly, very clearly the narrative has to have a linear structure. All right. The moment you have gone into this kind of a written material, the narrative has gone into a written structure, whereas a purely oral form like someone standing up and telling a story may not necessarily have a linear structure. So, the understanding is that stories like Panchatantra till a long period of time were not written down, and therefore, it incorporated many stories, it developed a branch like structure. All right. However, the moment it gets into some kind of a fixed form, the scroll can only open in one particular way, and therefore, that sort of fixes a certain linearity to the narrative form. The narrative has to move from one image to the next and to the next, and so on. In the case of the Kawad, there is a possibility that because the Kawad opens in multiple sorts of ways, there is a possibility that multiple sort of routes in the narrative could be adopted, while telling the story. It is not only the subcontinent. Just to give you an example, there are many examples across the world. You have this Kamishibai tradition from Japan. These are, as you can see in the picture lower, this guy has this entire, the storyteller has the entire equipment on a bicycle. So, it is a mobile format, and therefore, what they do is just move there, they fix all the cards with all the displays within them, and within it, and they pull out one card at a time, which reveals the card just in the next slide or next card behind the one that has been pulled out. And very interestingly, the stories could be written behind the card that has been pulled out. So, the story for the next card is written on the slide, the previous slide, behind the previous slide. So, in this particular case, therefore, a kind of a written narrative is possible. But very interestingly, this is a narrative which, because it is a kind of a separate slides, separate images, one can, before telling the story, rearrange the slides, and the order of the exact the sequence of the slides can be altered by the storyteller on each occasion. So, what I am trying to draw to your attention is that the way the stories, the oral narratives are physicalized, through image making or through writing, determines what kind of narrative structure that particular story will take. In the case of the Patachitra, for example, as I said, because the scroll can only open from one end to the other end, the story has to have a linear structure. Whereas, in the case of the Kamishibai, it is possible that there are certain elements which can be rearranged. Whereas, when a narrative is completely oral, like that of the Alif Laila, before it was written down, it could actually rearrange, or the Panchatantra could actually be rearranged a whole lot more. Many elements can come in, go out, many other things can happen. It is a lot more greater flexibility depending on the time and the occasion in which the story is being told. All right. Just to now going back to the tradition of Dastangoi, what I am going to show you are some of the illustrations which are famous illustrations from the Dastane Amir Hamza or the Hamza Nama. All right. As I said, Amir Hamza was supposed to be an uncle of Prophet Muhammad. So, really the stories really develop in the 7th to 8th century Arabia. That is where it can be traced back to. You must remember that Islam along with Christianity are two religions which are religions of the book, right. So, where the holy book of that particular religion is actually written down. and if there are different sects, then they have their own books, right. So, the Quran or the Bible. So, therefore, Islam being a tradition of the book, associated with it, we can trace that the story, since it is associated with Prophet Muhammad and somewhere a link to the development of Islam, we can also suggest that probably the earliest written records of Dastangoi as a form also coincide with the rise of Islam, because what the rise of Islam actually signifies is certain watershed changes that would have happened within the Middle Eastern Arabian universe in the 7th and 8th centuries. However, one must say that we know that stories are never created completely original, they will always have some basis. So, one can imagine that the oral tradition of what we know today as Dastangoi would be going back further earlier from the 7th century. All right. So, to tell you in a nutshell the story is there is a general format. Now, there are many stories which have a general format, right. I mean, the Akbar Birbal stories, for example, they have a general format. Akbar and Birbal, there is based on a riddle, and ultimately Akbar thinks Birbal is going to get into trouble, but using his wit, Birbal actually manages to free himself or show himself as someone who is witty, someone who is clever, and wins back the trust of the Jahapana or the emperor. That is the structure. Within that, and therefore, the reader always knows that Birbal is ultimately going to be vindicated. And this is the way oral narratives actually occur. We know that in Betal Pachisi, that they are at the end of the story, at the end of any particular episode, any particular story, Betal is going to fly back and go back into the forest, and Bikram will have to go and fetch him. So, the end is always known, what is going to happen, that the story will end in a riddle, that is something that is known. All right. So, in this particular case, actually there are two polar opposites within the set of stories. There is this Amir Hamza and the trickster who is Afrasiab, and it is a battle between the warrior, the honest, the brave Amir Hamza, and on the other hand there is the trickster and with his team of other tricksters, which is and the jinns and others, which is Afrasiab, and it is a battle between Amir Hamza and Afrasiab, and in the end Amir Hamza will always win. All right. So, these stories actually grew as they traveled through the Middle East and Central Asia, and as they traveled they gathered more local stories into the corpus of the tales which are Dastangoi. So, there was no fixed book. A particular Dastangoi will have a particular set of repertoire of Amir Hamza stories. The more experienced Dastangoi, the more popular Dastangois would have a greater repertoire of stories. So, having a greater repertoire of stories is very useful, because you make sure that you will always have something new to offer to the particular group audience, because if there are many Dastangois, they would all be telling stories, and maybe the audience would have heard a particular story. So, you really would make a mark if you had a particular unique story, a new story to offer. It is like telling jokes during a dinner party. If everybody knows the joke, it falls flat. Similarly, so the oral repertoire had to be large. So, there would be not any fixed book. People would know various stories, they will have a different collection of stories that they would have, mostly embodied. All right. However, there was another tradition also, which I will come to for a moment, but the most important point is that these stories, as they traveled through Central Asia, through Persia and what are other parts of the Middle East, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan and other places, they sort of collected many more stories within this pantheon, various people would have various Dastangois would have various repertoire, and as people travel, so stories would travel with them, and stories, the evidence suggests that the stories started emerging within the Indian subcontinent somewhere between the 11th and 14th century, quite naturally so, because this was the time when the Islamic rulers started emerging in India, right. And along with them there came an entire set of culture, entire set of literature, and entire set of food habits and stories. Okay. So, as well as architecture, so many things came along with each change of, and this has been happening within the subcontinent, indeed all parts of the world, where people, when new empires are created, they create newer cultural inputs and have a supplementary effect on the entire culture of the place where people have come and settled down, right. So, it around the 13th or 14th, the 11th to the 14th century, between that these stories slowly start emerging into India. And as the stories travel, so Amir Hamza also travels to different lands in his infancy, and even as a and some parts of the most lovable parts of these stories is the stories of Amir Hamza, the little child, or the person who the young boy who is able to, who has many adventures. He is obviously a very naughty person, so it's very popular with these stories were very popular with the kids, one can imagine. And he travels and takes on various adventures and encounters various interesting people, and tries his prowess over them, daring. He is a very daring young man, and this fame of the Amir Hamza stories, this spreads far and wide within the story, and he is then called by the chief minister of the king of Persia to aid him in his troubles, during his troubles, all right. And what one of the important things that he can fight is the emperor of the sorcerers, which is Afrasiab Jadoo. And Hamza is busy fighting against all the jinns and the tricksters under the Afrasiab Jadoo, and he actually manages through his wit and through his courage able to overcome the forces of Afrasiab. Now, these stories slowly they move into courts, they become very popular. So, the rulers also get interested in them, and so one of the important rulers who took on these stories was Akbar. Akbar himself was extremely fond of these stories and storytelling in general, and he himself told stories, but most importantly the thing that Akbar did was that he commissioned, and these images that you are seeing comes from that Hamza Nama, which is the Hamza Nama or the Dastane Amir Hamza, is a set of folios, very large paintings, which would be kept upright, and the audience, a lot of them. So, you did not have projection devices in those days. So, therefore, you had to have large paintings for a lot of people to, the entire court to be able to watch and see and enjoy. And so, there were about 1400 illustrations that were painted, and these are some of the examples. If I could let you through some of the images once again, each of the images sort of captures a certain important episode of a particular tale of the Dastane Amir Hamza, and so these folios were painted, and they were behind each of the paintings. the parts of the story, there will be text which will be inscribed. So, you can imagine when the folio is put up, there is the storyteller who stands next to the folio and tells the story and can refer to the story, to the written text from time to time, and be able to sort of tell the story in a much more rely lesser and lesser on the on memory. All right. Now, once again, just like our Japanese form, the kamishibai, these folios could be rearranged. Okay. Usually there would be one folio to every story, sometimes there could be more than one folio to every story, but the stories could be told in any particular order, and therefore, because they exist as distinct shape, unlike that of a codex, right, or a scroll. So, in a codex, each of the pages are then bound together in the spine altogether, and you cannot rearrange the pages as you want. However, a set of slides, a set of folios could be rearranged as one wishes. All right. Now, so this kind of audiovisual kind of storytelling was very appreciated and enjoyed by the court and even outside the court. Now, as we move on, the centuries, we have these stories getting into folklore, people within the general masses, and these stories would get into the day to day, everyday languages that people would be using. So, as we know, the language of the people within the northern part of the subcontinent was Hindustani or Urdu, and that would be the kind of narrative. And the moment that happened, you would have that that you can expect many of the local stories then start entering into these narratives. All right. The first evidence of Urdu text of Dastangoi being printed was in the early 19th century under the aegis of the Fort William College, which is the British. Remember, when the British came here, they had administrators who came in from England, and they needed to, in order to administer, they needed to learn the local language. So, while learning the local language, one of the methods of learning languages is through learning the literature of that particular community, of that language. And when they figured out that this is one of the stories which are available, which are popular at that point of time. So, one of the earliest Urdu printed versions of Dastangoi or the Dastan-e Amir Hamza was printed by the British in the form in the press of the Fort William College. Now, this form continued to retain its oral format till about the middle of the 19th century. You know, the printed volumes of the Fort William College were primarily those for learning, and they did not have the literacy was very limited within the population. So, these did not have too much of a circulation, so to say, within the general populace. But something very important happened at around the middle of the 19th century, which is what we variously call the First War of Independence or the Mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny. When all that happened, various Dastangos who at that point of time, you understand, Delhi was the center of the Mughal Empire, and most storytellers would travel to Delhi, as they do, as people do today, because it is a land of opportunities. But when Delhi was under threat, there was a lot of unrest in Delhi. People moved to Lucknow. Remember, during one of the important centers during the mutiny was Awadh, and a lot of these Dastangos, along with many other intellectuals of the times, moved to and artists of the times moved to Lucknow. So, the stories then moved to Lucknow. And once they moved to Lucknow, you know, these by then print had entered, and Lucknow becomes a very important space for print in within the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. And the Naval Kishore Press starts trying to print some of these stories, these volumes. Now, what happens then is there is an addition to these stories. When once they move to Lucknow, there is a movement of also narratives again mixing themselves in, and new stories being told. And then you have the tradition of the tilism, the idea of the tilism now moving into the Dastangoi narratives, all right, the tilism or the magical universe. Okay, those of you who are aware of the tilismic world, we would know that the Chandrakanta stories are a very important set of stories within the world of the tilism. Now, these stories, the similar kind of narratives would got involved with the traditional Amir Hamza stories, Dastane Amir Hamza stories, and they became much more over the centuries. They became much more subcontinental stories, very different from the tradition of the Persian. Now, the stories of the Arabic, Persian origins, which had not traveled to India, there was another route, and there one can study and see that was a venue, that was a venue where the stories became more musical. They would be sung, and was combined with music. That is a very different tradition. Whereas within the subcontinent, the storytelling tradition within the Dastangoi continued to remain one which was purely a vocal exercise. People would say stories. There were no musical instruments or use of any music involved along with it. All right. So, they primarily be storytelling. Now, what you see on the image here is an image from 1913 of someone, a kathakar or a storyteller who is telling a story. History tells us that there was a tradition of a storytelling session on the steps of the Jama Masjid in Delhi every Thursday, which would be there. But slowly these stories, the Naval Kishore Press started finding out when print comes in, and this is something we are going to see when we study print later on within Europe. When the first printers come in, they suddenly figure out that they need a lot of stories to be to tell, and so the Naval Kishore Press starts printing them. And in order to print them, they collect these stories. So, many of these stories were collected from various Dastangos, and it ran into many volumes. These stories actually ran into many volumes, each and there were about 46 volumes of 1000 pages each that were collected. Of course, while collecting these stories, they would undergo some change. The people who are actually inscribing these stories, writing these stories, would incorporate or even delete or leave out. There will be a lot of mutations involved in these stories when they are written down, but once written down, they have a fixed form. Today, it is this stories of Amir Hamza which come from the Tilisme-Hoshruba, which is the most interesting, most important chapter of this set of volumes which are published by the Naval Kishore Press. Tilisme-Hoshruba is the tilism, the magical universe. Hoshruba is that which will rob your or take away your equanimity, hosh, consciousness. One can take over consciousness, the magic will take over your consciousness. Tilisme-Hoshruba, that is the story which was told. But slowly over time, what happened, print takes over, and then this was by and large by the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century, the last Dastangos really can be have been recorded. The coming of theatre, the Parsi theatre, then very soon after the coming of films and the coming of the talkies, slowly this tradition of oral storytelling dies out. All right. So, and till it has got revived over about a decade ago, since about 2005, 2006, some artists have revived these stories. More about Dastangoi in our next session. Thank you.